Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name's Sophie Gilliatt-Ray, and I'm the director of the Islam UK Centre here at Cardiff University. Tonight's lecture is the fourth in a series of weekly public lectures organised by the Islam UK Centre. And our annual spring semester public lecture series began about 8 years ago as small in-house weekly seminars, and each year they seem to have grown in scope and significance. Tonight's lecture is a good example of this growth and development, and I'm absolutely delighted that we're joining with the Equality and Human Rights Commission for Wales for tonight's event. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Jennifer Dunn and her colleagues for all their hard work and attention to detail in the planning of tonight's lecture. It's been a real pleasure to work with you all, and I'm grateful for the effort and the collaboration that's underpinned all aspects of the planning and organisation. Having made these thanks, I'd like to extend a very warm welcome to all of you here this evening, either those of you here present in this venue or joining us virtually via our live streaming facility. During much of February and early March, the Islam UK Centre has been running a MOOC, or a massive open online course about Muslims in Britain. Through the powers of technology and the fantastic support of the Cardiff University Learning Technology team, led by Dr. Nathan Roberts, our weekly lectures here in Cardiff have been accessible to an international audience of learners numbering well over 5,500 people. The MOOC aims to disseminate high-quality academic scholarship about Islam and Muslims free of charge to as wide an audience as possible. And so whether you're here in Cardiff tonight or located further afield, I'd like to welcome you to tonight's lecture. Before our event gets underway more formally, I've got some very small housekeeping notices. It would be very helpful if you could please put mobile phones onto silent because we are recording. And if the fire alarm goes off, the exits are here, and at the back of the room. We're not expecting a fire practice. So with these practicalities dealt with at this point, I'd like to hand over to Anne Bynon, OBE, the Wales Commissioner for the Equality and Human Rights Commission and the chair of tonight's lecture. Thank you.
Diolch yn fawr iawn, Sophie. Thank you very much indeed. A croeso un ag oll, ledled y byd ag yma yn y brifddinas. We welcome you all. As Sophie said, I'm the Commissioner for Wales for the Equality and Human Rights Commission. My name is Anne Bynon. I'm really pleased to welcome you to our annual lecture. And I'm delighted that we are working this evening in partnership with the Centre for the Study of Islam in the UK at Cardiff University. It's great that we've got some people attending the lecture virtually via the Muslims in Britain Changes and Challenges massive open online course, or the MOOC that Sophie referred to. Obviously, as Sophie said, we don't want mobile phones to ring, and we don't want people to be possibly answering email on Blackberries either, but it would be quite nice if you wanted to tweet, and you're welcome to do that. And the hashtag you will need is EHRC and Islam UK Centre. Okay, one word. So I'll say once again, EHRC and Islam UK Centre. Centre spells R-E at the end, okay? So enjoy tweeting. So for those of you who are new to us, I think it would be helpful if I just briefly explain the type of work that we do as a commission. The Equality and Human Rights Commission is a public body set up to challenge discrimination, to promote equality, to protect and promote human rights. I hyrwyddo hawliau dynol. When our commission was created by Parliament, we were tasked with making the case for human rights and why they matter to us all. In 2009, we achieved A status as a national human rights institution. This means our achievements in monitoring and advising on human rights are recognised internationally by the United Nations. This is something we are very proud of, and actually is very, very important to the UK as a nation state. Just a few words on human rights. Obviously, the tragic events in Paris have generated an international debate about freedom of expression and human rights. Some of us were at the Senedd, a very moving event recently, to note our support and our empathy for what had happened in Paris. Now, freedom of expression is a fundamental right protected by our Human Rights Act. However, it is not an absolute right. It can and should be restricted in certain circumstances. For instance, when it incites violence against others or promotes hatred based on someone's sexual orientation or their religion. Everyone is equal for the purposes of human rights. A human being's beliefs, ethnic origin, gender, age, sexual orientation, or any other characteristic should never be a reason for self-respect and dignity to be ignored. Our role is in helping others to understand this. That's why we've invited you here today. Now, I'm delighted that Dr. Chris Allen has agreed to give this year's lecture, and will explore Islamophobia through the lens of human rights. Chris is a lecturer in social policy at Birmingham University, and for the past decade, Chris has been at the forefront of academic research on the subject of Islamophobia. As well as appearing regularly in the media in recent years, Chris has worked alongside the UK government in an advisory capacity. There will be an opportunity to ask Chris questions at the end of this lecture, and I'm very excited about the lecture being live streamed and the possibility that we will have questions from who knows where across the globe. Excellent. Now, first of all, however, I just must introduce Chris and say how pleased I am that he's here to share with us his perspective on human rights and Islamophobia. Chris.
Good evening, everyone. Salam alaikum. And I missed the trick with learning Welsh on how to say hello to the Welsh people. And it was only when you said it, I thought, immediately I've lost the audience. So hello in Welsh as well. Thanks so much. I mean, this is absolutely fantastic turnout, and I really appreciate everyone turning up. I just wanted to pick up on a point that Sophie made, and we were chatting because when the kind of seminar series first started, it was interesting because I came about sort of, I don't know, 8 or 9 years ago, and it was a very small thing. So this is now kind of super scary and a lot bigger. But it's also testament to the great work that the Centre's done here in Cardiff, and really is, sort of testament to the kind of vision that Sophie had in terms of this. And also as well to the Equality and Human Rights Commission. Before I went to Birmingham, after getting my PhD and before going to Birmingham as a lecturer, I worked for an Equalities and Human Rights advocacy group. And so the kind of, when I was working for that, the Equality Act 2006 came in, which was the first time we actually begin to see the kind of human rights and this kind of this broadening of the equalities agenda coming to the fore. So, so again, to be working with the HRC in terms of this is an exciting opportunity for me. So tonight I'm going to be talking about Islamophobia, and I'm going to be talking about sort of this and hopefully trying to put it within some sort of frame of a human rights perspective. And it's really about sort of beginning a conversation. It's about beginning this conversation of where Islamophobia fits and how do we actually get into this kind of position where human rights might give us something different, might give us a different perspective on how to look at Islamophobia. It might give us a different lens or a different language for how we talk about it. But it also might give us a kind of different approach in terms of how we try and tackle it. And I think that all of those things are actually quite important in terms of this. Okay, so the first thing I want to start off with is, because I think that we have to acknowledge that Islamophobia is a contested and also a controversial term. And I want to kind of address this right on the outset, you know, so that we know, so that you know where I stand on this, and so that when I'm talking about things, you kind of know where this is kind of fitting in terms of this. Okay, so it's an interesting one because I've been kind of researching Islamophobia now for kind of 15, 16 years, and I still find the same complexities and the same contestation now as what I was encountering back in 2000. And it's really interesting because we don't seem to have moved ahead too far. And it's interesting that the same kind of things have kind of actually sort of you know still there in the kind of space we are. I think in academic terms, and don't worry, I'm not making this overly academic tonight. So I think that, you know, we see now that it's actually that things are beginning to move. It's actually a term that's now kind of been accepted. There's a number of people beginning to look at this. But it's also this much more critical approach. And I think that for me, it's about this kind of, we've kind of moved into this, what I call kind of critical Islamophobia studies now. It's not just about the black and white, it's about the bit in the middle that's grey. And that bit in the middle that's grey is much more complex and much more difficult to navigate, and is forever changing. And I think that now we're in this space where we kind of try and take things a little bit more forward, but also try and think about this kind of like, you know, in terms of, as Brian Klug says there, that Islamophobia has now come of age. And so I think in terms of this, so there's also this issue around caveats. So I'm going to give you caveats as well. You see, I'm kind of giving myself like kind of a safety net here that I don't fall through, you know. So I'm giving you some necessary caveats as well. And I think that one of the things that I have to stress is that Islamophobia is not solely a consequence of 9/11 or 7/7 or the murder of Lee Rigby, or the attacks on Charlie Hebdo, or the attacks on the hostage taking in Sydney. Islamophobia is not exclusive to any of those. All of these work as triggers. So when we have Lee Rigby's murder, we see the levels of attacks on Muslims at street level go up. We see them spike. After 7/7, after 9/11, you know, we were chatting earlier. I was talking to the BBC earlier. We were talking about this idea around when people from Cardiff go to fight in Syria, and it becomes a news story. Anxieties and fears go up. You know, who else is going? How many Muslims know? These Muslims are all going to go over there. The levels and fears of anxiety goes up, and actually, what we see is that, you know, it becomes like sort of, you know, sort of you get that spike in attacks. But it's not actually exclusive to that. There's Islamophobia that's bubbling along. And even if we didn't have any more events that would have its triggers, it would still be there. There would still be Muslims being attacked and abused on the street and so on. And also the term. So I'm always asked, you know, what about the term? You know, well, you know, it's not about a fear of Islam. It's not about a fear of religion. And then you get those go, I hate all religions, you know, so I'm an Islamophobe and proud. Okay, so what we have to do is that we're in this beautiful British tradition of finding a word that doesn't mean what we're talking about, but then using it. So it's, you know, so it's beautifully British, you know, like, so we've got homophobia, we've got anti-Semitism, we've got Islamophobia, you know. It's not literal. And if we apply it literally, we're doing a disservice to all of these issues. And in the same way we don't apply anti-Semitism on a kind of literal way, then we can't, you know, sort of do this with Islamophobia as well. And so it's much more than this kind of fear. It's much more kind of akin to the way in which racism functions, or akin to the way in which anti-Semitism functions. And it can take various different forms and manifestations, and I'll come on to those in a moment. And another big question I get asked is, well, you know, if we use Islamophobia and it shuts down debate, it shuts down criticism. No, it doesn't. It's perfectly fine to criticize the atrocities that Islamic State are committing in the Middle East. That is not Islamophobic at all. If you say all Muslims in this country want to behead all white people and Westerners in the same way that Islamic State do, that's when you're taking it and you're using it in a completely different way. But condemnation itself, condemnation of people going into the Charlie Hebdo offices and opening fire, is not Islamophobic at all. And it's about being honest, and it's about being open. And there's a difference between actual criticism and condemnation and disagreement, and actually using those things to try and stereotype and increase or incite hatred against all Muslims. And I think that we have to be, we have to be really, really clear on that. And also as well, it's perfectly fine if you're a Christian to say, I don't believe in your religion. That's not Islamophobic either. It's perfectly fine to have disagreements. These disagreements in themselves are not about sort of something which is inciting hatred. Having said that, there are those some who will try and shut down a debate. You're Islamophobic. You're not Islamophobic. Islamophobia doesn't exist. What we have to do there is, this is why I'd say we're in this grey area now. We have to be honest, and we have to be transparent, and we have to be critical, we have to be nuanced, and we have to be all of those things, and we have to have trust to be able to have that. And sometimes we need to create these safe spaces like we have tonight, where we can have these discussions and debates, where we can be much more open with each other. Because actually sometimes in those political spaces or in the media spaces, it's very difficult to have these discussions without being bombarded with lots and lots of different things. So it's about sort of, being sort of honest in terms of this. And one last thing is, people say to me, well, give me a definition of Islamophobia. Give me a precise definition. And my response to that is, well, when we talk about racism, or we talk about sexism, or we talk about homophobia, we don't ever say, give me a definition before I recognize the phenomenon exists. A lot of the time, these are smokescreens. This is something which is like, fluid. Racism is fluid. Sort of discrimination against of any group is a very fluid thing. It doesn't have, strict confines. And that's exactly the same with Islamophobia as well. So yes, we can work towards definitions. Yes, we can come up with definitions, and there are some definitions, particularly at the European level. But actually, that mustn't be the start point from where we say, okay, well, until we get this definition that we all agree and we all accept, that we can't talk about the actual consequences and the way in which it impacts people. Okay, so so in my research, I've tried to give like a couple of levels of way in which it works, and I just want to give those very quickly in terms of that. So what we see is that Islamophobia is very similar and works in exactly the same way as any other discriminatory phenomenon. So it's not as though this is, the distinct side of it is that it's directed towards Muslims or those perceived to be Muslims. And it has the issue around being Muslim or Muslimness or Islamicness as being the driver for that. But it's very much, it's very the same, it's very similar and as complex as every other discriminatory phenomenon as well. And so at one level, it kind of works ideologically. Now, in an academic setting, we could write a whole module that lasts a whole academic year, and we still don't really know what ideology is. So trying to give it in the kind of a way in which you can understand it is I talk about this kind of notion of white noise. And what's out there. And you walk in WH Smith's in the morning and you see the Daily Express, and on the front cover is a picture, a closely cropped picture of a Muslim woman wearing a niqab. And all you can see is her eyes and everything is black. Now, I guarantee if you say to people, what's that news story about on the front page? They get this from the white noise that's out there. They know it's not about a Muslim woman who saved an old lady from falling down the stairs. So it's not about a Muslim woman wearing a niqab who's climbed a tree and saved a cat. This is a story. Immediately you see that image and it makes those connections. So it's about this white noise. It's about what we know about Muslims. And it's about that kind of problematization. So that's how I kind of give that kind of explanation on ideology. The next part is that kind of the kind of derogatory attitudes, the kind of, the prejudices, and that typically underpin the kind of exclusionary practices, the kind of things that the Equality and Human Rights Commission are looking at in terms of employment and housing, in terms of public services, discrimination at that level there. And then the final level is the issue around hate crime. And for me, that's where we begin to see Islamophobia come into the kind of public spaces a little bit more, in terms of abuse, in terms of violence, in terms of harassment, in terms of threat, in terms of somebody going about their ordinary life and their day-to-day business, and somebody decides that they're so angry that they hate Muslims that they have to attack that Muslim woman just because they've recognized her as a Muslim woman. So that for me is where you see this hate crime that comes into the kind of that street level. So I'm going to give you a sort of give you a very quick overview of the kind of things that we kind of talked about at that kind of last level. And I'm really drawing upon some research we did back in 2013. I did this with my two colleagues at the university, Arshad Isakji and Oslam Young. And what we did there was we went out and we found, using an organisation called Tell Mama, which acted as a conduit for us, they actually sort of introduced us and gave us access to visible Muslim women who had become victims of street crime, of kind of street level hate crime. And what we did was we went out and we interviewed those and we tried to find out what their experience was. We were trying to challenge this idea that Neil Chakraborty and Irene Zempi have said about the invisibility of Muslims, you know, the invisibility of Muslim women. And so we were trying to sort of, you know, begin to challenge that in terms of where we are with that. Now, the purpose of the report was twofold, and one of the things here kind of resonates with this issue around human rights. And the first one was to speak in the public and media spaces about this notion, the ongoing victimization of Muslim women. And it says there to give a human voice. Now, this is lifted out of that report, to give a human voice. Because actually, and I'll try and prove this as we go through it tonight, is that Muslim women are rarely seen as humans. You know, in fact, the process of Islamophobia in some way dehumanizes all Muslims, because actually the Muslim who might be sitting next to you tonight in the kind of wider perception may be the exact same as the Muslim who's in with Islamic State, or maybe is with Boko Haram, or is maybe in Afghanistan, because all Muslims become the same. They become seen to be the same. And so what we wanted to do there was we wanted to put a voice forward. And one of the things we did with this report was that we actually used the women's voices themselves to write the report. So it's the women's voices that actually are used to tell the stories and to try and convey the kind of realities and the kind of detrimental impact that Islamophobia creates. And the second one was to kind of get this into the political and policy spaces, because my view is that really, if we're genuinely honest and we're open on this, is that Islamophobia is not being taken seriously in the political spaces. We have a coalition government that's set up the all-party parliamentary group and the cross-government working group on anti-Muslim hatred, but a lot of this is around lip service. Have we seen any policies? No. Have we seen any approaches? No. Have we seen any, initiatives or anything new coming out of that? None whatsoever. And so I think that we really have to be honest here, and we have to keep banging this issue home, and so we get a conversation going about this. And this is where I think that maybe we can come in with this new approach to it. Okay, so, and this is the reason why we wanted to get this voice, because if you look at this image, and this is taken from a newspaper, the amount of times we see this image, less than 1% of Muslim women in Britain wear the niqab. Look in the media, 90, 95, 99% of images of Muslim women in the media will be shown looking like this. The disparity between actual what Muslim women look like and what the symbolic representation is two completely different things. And with this comes otherness, with this comes like sort of not being a part of who we are. All of these kind of ideas that come through just by looking at that image. And so it actually sort of dehumanizes. This isn't actually a woman, this is a symbolic representation of all the things that's wrong or problematic about Muslims and Islam in Britain, in the West, in the world, at whatever level you want to take that. Okay, so these are these are some of the kind of statistics that made us want to drive this, and so hopefully, we're kind of we'll give you some new statistics here in terms of why Muslim women, as the idea that Muslim women are increasingly seen as problematic, but also seen as kind of conduits for for government as well. And you have this balance in between, the barrier to integration, the way a Muslim woman looks or some Muslim women look is that barrier to integration. But then on the other hand, it's about they are the people who are uniquely placed to stop their sons and daughters going to Syria and Iraq as well. And so the politicians, flip from one side to the other in terms of what the Muslim woman is. Is she a friend? Is she an ally? Is she an enemy? Is she against us? And where do we stand in terms of that? And then when you actually look at the actual sort of the attacks on Muslim women, the 58% in the UK of the data we have in the UK are reported against Muslim women. If you look in Europe at the Fundamental Rights Agency, you'll see that their research says that over 70% of all attacks on Muslim women, of all attacks on Muslims are against Muslim women. But the actual, like the real statistic there is that 80% of those will be visible. So if you're a Muslim woman here tonight who actually looks Muslim and can be identified as being Muslim, your chances of being attacked at that street level is much higher than everybody else in the room. And so, this is why we wanted to actually do this research, because actually sort of Muslim women are at the brunt, they take the brunt of this kind of street level attacks. And it's really unusual for women to be the primary victim of hate crime. If you look at anti-Semitism or homophobia or racism, if you look at hate crime as a whole, it's primarily a phenomena that's directed towards men. And so only when we talk about Islamophobia is it that women actually become the primary victims of that. And so, we see this anomaly here. And so most of the kind of things that we kind of experienced when we were doing the research was we was asking people what was said to them. And what we get there is these kind of broad generic insults. So Muslim scum, a suicide bomber, being called a terrorist. Then we get the kind of combination of kind of religion and race, so Muslim monkey, and then you get this kind of the focus on the kind of issue around the niqab and the way in which it looks in terms of ninja and letterbox there. And then we talk about sort of this. One of the things that we found in the research was the fact that this isn't just taking place in the public spaces. A lot of it is actually taking place where Muslim women live. Actually, where Muslim families are, people are going there and attacking them there. In the same way as well, one of the big findings of the piece of research was that actually many attacks take place on school playgrounds or on the way to school or on the way back from school, being attacked by other parents. Suddenly something will happen in the news and suddenly the Muslimness of one of the parents will become primary. And then the anxiety that creates in terms of, do I leave my children at school? Because actually I've been attacked there. And so what we have here is that the names have been, the names were changed deliberately so that we kept the anonymity and the confidentiality and the trust of the people who were our research participants. But as she says there, the levels of abuse increased steadily, culminating in two from the group turning up at our house, at which point they violently attacked both me and my brother with bicycle chains. This was someone who had moved to a new area, and there was a gang at the end of the street who increasingly become more vitriolic with their abuse. And then this happened one night. The two men who did this were actually sort of arrested by the police because Halima was able to identify them. And those two were given they were required not to go within a certain distance of the house. But the gang had about 20 people in. So whilst the two who had the exclusion zone put on them, the other 18 continued in terms of giving them abuse. And so what we see is that, in your own home, you don't even feel safe. You feel threatened, you feel attacked, you feel vilified in your own home. And then we had Shagufta, and Shagufta was on the train. She was going to university, and she was on the train, and it was the morning rush hour. And she says that, she told us that the train was busy, and that two men got on the train, and they sat next to her. And then one began to sort of make jokes about her being a terrorist. And what's interesting, if you look at all hate crimes, is that actually people who see it very rarely respond. Whether it's homophobia, whether it's disablism, whether it's sort of anti-Semitism or Islamophobia, people around don't respond. And this increases the levels of humiliation within the victim. And what we saw here is that not only was she called a terrorist, but she said that, as she went to move, one of the men actually got up and tapped her on the head, in front of everyone on a crowded train, and then made remarks about her hijab before shouting down the train that she had a bomb in her bag. And as she said, she felt extremely vulnerable in this really crowded space. And so this is, you know, these sort of things around terrorism, you know, you're a terrorist, you know, having a headscarf pulled or being spat upon because you wear a niqab. This was very much like the things that were very normal in terms of the experience. Alia said she was called a terrorist by a male accuser. And again, it was interesting how many of the kind of perpetrators were male and picked on women, you know, and directing their sort of vitriol. And then he claims that she was intimidating him. And she was quite feisty in terms of herself as an individual. And she questioned him as to why she was intimidating him. And he said, it's because you're Muslim. And as she said there, I found it hilarious and annoying. I'm kind of small and he was a huge guy. I don't look terrorizing or intimidating, yet he does. But it was her Muslimness, it was her recognition as being Muslim that he said was actually intimidating him. And he didn't want to be there. He didn't want her in his space. He didn't want her in his vicinity. Deborah was a white convert to Islam, and she spoke about sort of going to a gym a couple of times a week and seeing the same people, seeing the same sort of women at the gym and taking part in that, you know, being in that public space. And then she said that one week she was waiting for a yoga class to start, and she saw some of the women becoming increasingly agitated whilst looking in her direction. And then she said that it culminated in one of the women walking over, followed by the rest of the group, and they called her Mrs. Osama bin Laden. And then they said they didn't like her clothes, go back to Afghanistan, go and eat some pork. So, you know, if we're trying to find like sort of, you know, sort of evidence that this is about Islam, about being Muslim, here we have a very clear statement that they know this person is Muslim and they know some of the things that they think might be offensive to Muslims. And so, you know, we see this in terms of, you know, sort of, you know, the kind of specificity of sort of Islamophobia and the sort of things that people experience. Now, this is one which really kind of brings me into this kind of realm of human rights, because if we think about human rights, they are something which is, you know, relevant to us all. You know, we're all humans. We all have rights. You know, each of us are individuals. And yet when you look at this, so Rachel again was another white convert, and she had gone back to her home and she was in a car with her husband, and as they came along, there was a car parked across their drive. She got out the car and she went over to the driver and she asked the driver to move. And what she said was, when she was conveying it to us, was she said, he kept saying this, get away from me, thing. So he didn't even acknowledge her humanness. He didn't even acknowledge her humanity. It was thing. Get away from me, thing. And then he said, thing, get away from me. I'll pop you, Muslim. So the only thing that he noticed about her was that she was Muslim and that she was a thing. She wasn't a woman. She wasn't like a human. She wasn't a person. She didn't have any sort of feelings or emotions or any of these things. She was a thing. And then her husband came over to see what was wrong, and then the driver got out the car, and the driver then punched her husband to the floor, and he kicked him while he was on the floor, and then he got back in the car and he drove the car at Rachel and he hit her with the car. And then what she said to us is that she said, it doesn't matter how white you are. He still gave me a really dirty look and said, fucking packy bastard. So, you know, so he didn't even see the person. He didn't even, you know, he couldn't even see who she was. She was just a thing. And all of those things in his head come to the fact that she was, you know, this kind of stereotype, this caricature, this symbol of what it is to be a Muslim. The worst part about this was that Rachel was 7 months pregnant at the time. So when he drove the car at her, he actually hit her. He hit her with a car and she was 7 months pregnant. When we launched the report, we used this as a case study in the Huffington Post, and we put this in the Huffington Post. What was interesting, there was 122 comments. I never read the comments underneath an article when I write one. You know, it's just not worth it. But my research colleague did, and he's young and inexperienced. And he showed me some of them, and all of the comments were, "Why did that Muslim man let his wife get out the car if he knew she was pregnant? What does a traitor like her expect?" You know, this was how they were. There was not one comment there that actually went, "This is disgusting. This is disgraceful. You know, how must that woman feel? All of those things were there in terms of sort of the thing. You are a thing. Okay, so let's have a look at the impacts now. So we've kind of seen the manifestations, and when we talked to the Muslim women, you know, they were talking about being scared. They were talking about fearing of going out. You know, some said to us that they don't go shopping anymore, that they go out, you know, kind of secretive ways. They felt anxious and vulnerable. They also had shock and anger and humiliation, and they had, some of them said that they had psychological problems, some of which didn't actually start in the immediate aftermath, but, you know, a month or two afterwards, this kind of not being able to sleep, you know, crying a lot and so on, you know. So we see this. And this would be very similar to people, sort of research done by Victims of Support in terms of the kind of impact on any victims of crime, but in particular hate crime as well. So there's nothing kind of distinct or different in terms of this. So a couple of quotes there from them. You know, Mahmouda said she was really scared and she was fearful and she felt vulnerable and she felt shaken. And Rahana said that, you know, she was in the middle of the street and she suddenly felt like, you know, like she really vulnerable. She had a bottle thrown at her while she was walking down the road. A car had gone past. They shouted some abuse about her being Muslim. They then came past and they threw a bottle at her while she was walking down the street. And she said that she was worried about her life. And she said that she started going out in this secretive way. She didn't really want people to see her because she was scared that other people were going to attack her because she was Muslim. And then when we look at Sharifa, you know, and you know, some really interesting, you know, and in terms of giving that voice. So she said, it made me feel very scared. I was scared to go out in the street and into the air on my own. It made me think continuously that I need some sort of self-defense class so that I know how to defend myself and protect my children. So it's not just about her being a victim, but now that anxiety and that worry and that fear kind of goes out into her family as well. And as she says, you start to think that something is going to happen. It kind of makes you feel like somebody is ready to attack you in the street. It kind of makes you think people hate you because of the way you dress. And then you start linking everything as being anti-Muslim. And that may not be the case. For example, some people give you a look which may be nothing, but. And so that doubt had been placed there. So now, this was somebody who walked down the street and enjoyed, you know, life and lived their life on an everyday basis in a normal way. But all of a sudden, she becomes a victim, and even someone looking at her, she's now thinking, does she hate me because I'm Muslim? So, you know, you can see where this kind of, when politicians talk about Muslim communities retreating and not wanting to integrate, well, actually, you know, because when you see this, you can see that the actual impact is that, of course, people are going to retreat. And then we have another couple who says that, you know, you start to think that everybody has the potential to insult you. And then it says, you know, maybe we're never going to be seen to be British. Maybe we're always going to be seen to be an outsider. And when we have these political debates about, you know, why do people go to, you know, to Iraq and Syria? And I'm not trying to suggest that this is an absolute, you know, reason why, but actually that feeling of not belonging can actually feed into those and also be exploited by those who do have radical or extremist messages. You know, those feelings of belonging can be taken and manipulated by those on the extreme of the far right as well, you know. So, you know, it's about the kind of potential seedbed that this actually gives. And then Samina, this was an interesting one for us because she said that she felt she was British. She knew that her family's heritage was in Bangladesh. But she said it's when you become a victim of Islamophobia, the identity crisis comes in. And you suddenly don't feel like you belong anywhere. And then you start to question, am I a British Muslim or am I a Bangladeshi Muslim? And so you get this kind of, you know, you get these kind of huge impacts, you know, reevaluating your whole identity, you know, who you are, where you belong, and what you begin to be seen. And this for me was Halima. She said, you know, that they hate us because of our background and religion. And it's really interesting that she said, who I am is irrelevant. So she's not talking about herself as being Muslim there. She's talking about herself as being a person, someone who's real. Someone who we sit next to, someone who we talk to, someone who works with us. She's actually saying, who I am is irrelevant. And when you put that back with Rachel's comment that she was a thing, And this is what you see in terms of Islamophobia. The impact of Islamophobia is not just about being spat upon in the street or having a hijab pulled or being hit by a bicycle chain or being run over or having pigs' heads left outside your house while you're asleep at night. That's not just what Islamophobia is about. But it's about this. It's about this issue of being dehumanized. You become reduced so much that you become an empty vessel. And when I was writing my book, I said that this was the personal, the human, and the real becomes lost. So Muslims become Muslims. They don't become, oh, that's Sharifa. It's like Muslims, the Muslim community, Muslims around the world. You know, it becomes reduced and reduced and reduced and reduced and reduced so much that actually we forget that they're real people. And that, you know, we see these images, you know, constantly fed these images. And actually it's very easy to just look at that and go, oh, it's a black figure. And we forget that actually behind that is a perfectly normal human being. And in the same way that all of us are human beings. So this is, for me, is a really important point, because actually when we're talking about this, we need to remember the human. And actually, if you think about this in terms of like sort of, you know, the kind of, you know, what's the actual impacts is that this can't just happen to anyone. You know, so a victim knows that this can't just happen to anyone. And yet at the same time, they also know that actually they're irrelevant, because it's actually just about sort of who and what they are. It's about them being attacked. And it's about them being Muslim rather than a Muslim. A Muslim actually gives, saying someone is a Muslim actually acknowledges that they are a person. If they're just Muslim, then there's no recognition of that person whatsoever. And what you get there is that all of these things, all of these the things that make us individual, the things that make us different, the things that make us funny, the things that make us likable or unlikable, as the case may be, all get stripped away. And the Muslims just become other, and they become different, and they become against us, who don't want to be here. And all of these stereotypes, so all of those things that exist in that kind of white noise is where we sit in terms of this. And what was said there is that even though Muslim women are hugely visible in society and in the media and in the political spaces, rarely do you hear their voice. Rarely do you find out who they are. If anybody remembers the image of the Muslim woman on the front page of The Sun wearing the hijab that was a Union Jack, it didn't matter who that woman was. It was the hijab, it was the message, it was the symbolism of that image that was actually being put forward. The actual Muslim woman who was wearing it, I mean, to be fair, it could have been anyone. It didn't even have to be Muslim, because it was the person themselves was so irrelevant in terms of that. And so how do we re-establish this humanity? How do we remember? How do we kind of rebuild this idea that actually, that everyone, that victims of Islamophobia are actually human? How do we try and go back to this idea around, and at the essence, the ethos of human rights is this issue, these issues of dignity, of respect, of equality and fairness. And all of us deserve that, not just those of us who don't look Muslim. You know, the beauty of human rights, and there really is a kind of beauty at the core of it, is that this is about everyone. Everybody should be given that respect and that dignity and that fairness and that equality. And we should be treated the same. We have the same rights, and we should be treated in the same way around it. And we should be able to access our rights and have our rights protected as well. And I sort of, you know, so there is this thing, you know, as Nelson Mandela said, to deny people their human rights is to challenge their very humanity. And if we don't use this to begin to tackle, if we don't use this to begin to kind of address these issues that are very real, you know, if we don't begin to look at this and see that Islamophobia is as awful and as bad as homophobia and racism and disablism and anti-Semitism, and I'm not creating any hierarchies here, I'm saying that all of them are unwanted and unprecedented in a society like that we live in today, then actually maybe we need to have this new approach. Maybe we need to begin to look at this in a new way. Because actually, if you're a victim of Islamophobia, it means that your individual human rights have been infringed. And this gives us a whole new perspective within which to look at this. This isn't now about sort of Muslims wanting a special deal. This isn't about Muslims playing the victim. You know, how many times have we heard this in the past when we have things to talk about racism? You know, it's like, oh, playing the race card or so on. This isn't about Muslims actually playing the Islamophobia card. This is about individuals having their human rights infringed. This is about us not doing our job in protecting the human rights of that individual. And so where we have this, we have the Equality Act of 2010, and we have the Human Rights Act, 1998. And what we have there is we have two, which are two rights which are enshrined in the European Convention on Human Rights, which are particularly pertinent here. And the first one is that, sorry, we have 16 basic rights, is the freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. Now that gives us the right to be able to have the religion we want, or no religion as well. This actually gives us, within this kind of framework of human rights, it gives us that opportunity to say, we don't have to agree with each other, but you as an individual, you have that right to believe that, and I have this right to believe this. And this doesn't mean that, all of these kind of like scare stories that the Daily Mail or the Daily Express will give you, that suddenly by having the human rights, like, sort of Sharia law is going to be imposed on Cardiff, or, sort of the Islamification of Wales and Britain and everywhere else. That's not the case. It's about an individual having their rights and being able to have their rights protected and being upheld in terms of that. And in Article 14, the prohibition of discrimination. And so all of us as well, not only do we have the right to be able to have our religion or no religion, whatever the case may be, but we also have the right to not be discriminated against. And when you start to look at this, you start to see that there's this is a new way of looking at it. This is not about kind of like a community advocating on one issue. This is not about sort of kind of going to government and trying to get special favours and trying to balance one thing against, okay, so we have this counter-terror legislation, so we'll give you a little bit of protection against religious incitement to religious hatred. No, this is not where we are now. We're actually taking a whole new different approach. And we're saying, we want people's human rights upheld, and we want their respect and dignity and their equality and fairness to be upheld as well in terms of that. And so we have this, we come to this kind of Britishness, British values. What are British values? Well, actually, human rights and our rights to be treated with all these things are actually beautifully British. We can go back to the Magna Carta, we can go to the Bill of Rights, the Claim of Right. All of these things, we have this tradition. We have this tradition. So let's not start talking about British values and using it in one particular way as the means by which we bash one particular community. You need to be more like us. No, actually, let us be more like who we are. And let us actually kind of embed equality and fairness much more into society and the way in which we deal with things. And so, so the Human Rights Act covers everyone. Even if you're sort of, it doesn't matter about your immigration status. And I've put up their dignity drive as well. If you want to know how human rights applies to you, have a look on the Equality and Human Rights Commission's website, and you can do the dignity drive. And it gives you all these little chances to find out how those things are actually relevant to you. Because actually in Britain, we have this thing where the human rights, they go on over there. They happen in Abu Ghraib in Iraq. It's what Amnesty International do. No, actually, we have human rights here. We have human rights issues here as well. And it's not a criminals charter. Don't believe the Daily Mail and the Daily Express. It's not a criminals charter. Lots of foreigners are not flocking to Britain so they can abuse their human rights, abuse the human rights legislation here. No, actually, what we've got is we've got a very clear, we've got a very beautiful kind of essence there, which is very, very British as well and comes through in our tradition of being British. Now, the Act itself only applies to public authorities. So when we start talking about these kind of hate crimes in the street, we're not really, the Human Rights Act and the kind of, the kind of Equalities Act, are not going to really cover that too well. But my argument here is that actually what we have, though, is we have a new place to start the conversation. So we have this, we understand this now in terms of public authorities. We understand this in terms of discrimination and prejudice and so on. So let's now have that as a start point for a new conversation. Let's not start going, well, because the Jewish community have got this, well, the Muslim community needs this. Well, because you did this with racism, you need to do this with Islamophobia. Well, give us okay, you can scrutinize us more. You can put more security legislation in place. If you give us a little bit more, you up the crime, sort of the sentencing around incitement to religious hatred. No, we haven't got to, this is not the way we're working now. What we're working now is we're starting in terms of a new conversation about human rights. And it's something that we all buy into. It's something that's very British. It's something where we can go, hang on a minute. Here's where the conversation starts now. And that conversation is going to be difficult, and I don't know where that conversation goes as yet, because, but it's new. But gives us a new way in which to do this. And so what I want to do is, I'm just going to wrap up now, because I realize that I'm probably getting very close to the sort of thing. And an example here is that, so it's rare that any politicians mention Islamophobia. Baroness Farsi accepted. But take Baroness Farsi out of the equation, and you can probably count the number of politicians on one hand, maybe even one or two fingers. I'm not sure. But what you have here is the Tackling Extremism Task Force report. And it says, we must tackle extremism of all kinds, including the Islamophobia, and espoused by sort of the murder of Mohammed Salim. Mohammed Salim was an elderly Muslim guy who was walking back from the mosque one night in Birmingham, and he was randomly murdered in the street, purely on the basis that he was Muslim. But what are we doing here? Look what the politicians are doing. Look where the policy discourse is. Look where the political discourse is. It's about tackling extremism. This report was in inquiry into the murder of Lee Rigby. Now, we all agreed that the murder of Lee Rigby was hideous. It was a horrible atrocity. It's those sort of things that we don't want in this country or anywhere. But actually, is that the space to be talking about, let's tackle Islamophobia? Because people will associate, well, if the Muslims didn't kill Lee Rigby, they wouldn't have this problem here. And it becomes very simplistic and very easy to dismiss. And so, if if you look at New Labour and the coalition, when they talk about giving protection against religion, it's normally at the same time as they're putting in counter-terror legislation. Look at it across New Labour and the coalition as well. And then this creates in the people's minds that there's no smoke without fire. And yet, actually, what we're seeing this as something which is about human rights, about individuals, about humans, about us here. It's not about about terrorists or people who commit barbaric atrocities on our streets. It's about real people, the people you work with, the people you live next door to. And Stuart Hall, he criticises. Stuart Hall is a fantastic cultural studies pioneer. And, he said this back in the 70s, mugging the state. And he said he's sick and tired of hearing that racism will stop when young black men stop mugging people. He said, because actually that's a criminal activity, and discrimination and racism is an unwanted phenomenon in Britain. And the two are not necessarily connected. People might use that to justify that, but actually they're not the same. And this is what he's seen, was that actually sort of, this is not a Muslim issue. This is not tackle the 9/11 and the 7/7s and the Lee Rigbys and Islamophobia will go away. No, it won't. It will still be there. And this is why we need that new frame. And I think that, what we need to do in terms of this is we need to begin to have that conversation. And what I'm going to, and final reflections on terms of this, because I realize I'm getting close to being up to. It doesn't matter what discriminatory phenomenon we're talking about, but we don't need it in society. We don't need it in British society today. If you look at British legislation, we have protection against transgender groups. And the reason why this is a very, very small minority, but the reason why we have that legislation is because we believe and we agree and we buy into the fact that actually everybody should be treated fairly. And that it doesn't really matter what you are or what you look like or what you believe in, but actually you deserve protection. You don't deserve to be discriminated against. And that's a very British thing. And so Islamophobia is exactly the same with that. Because actually, it doesn't matter about, there's more Muslims than there are transgender people. It's about the ethos that underpins it. It's about, we need to tackle this because it's wrong. And then what we see is that, it dehumanizes. It actually marginalizes, it vilifies. It takes people out of becoming that wonderful integrated Britain that we hear the politicians talk about. It breaks down cohesion. It breaks down all of those bonds between us because, as we go back to that quote, because once you become a victim of Islamophobia, once Islamophobia is out there, you become doubtful. You don't know, you question your own role here because of all these things. And it takes away who you are. And it also takes away and infringes your human rights. And I think that we have to acknowledge that, yes, we are still in this grey area, but to get out of that grey area, where we're trying to discuss this and where we're trying to talk about this, is that maybe we need that new route out. And maybe that start point and coming out of that is around the sort of framework of human rights. And so what I want to do is I want to leave you with a quote, and I don't really like sort of these cheesy like quotes, but I thought it was quite touching because actually it really does kind of sum up what we're kind of talking about. The rights of every man are diminished when the rights of one man are threatened. And I think that what we see in society at the moment is while we don't tackle Islamophobia, all of our rights are being threatened. If we allow this to go on, if we allow this to go unnoticed, if we allow those who, for whatever reason, want to deny or dismiss this as actually being a real and actual phenomena in everyday settings, then actually all of us will become threatened. Thanks very much for this evening. I hope I've raised some issues and I look forward to having more conversations with you. Thanks very much. And I didn't sneeze.
Diolch yn fawr iawn. Thank you very much indeed. I'd like to now invite Celine Kidwai, who's a member of the Commission's Wales Committee and also Chief Exec of the Muslim Council for Wales, to give a short reflection on what we have heard from Chris and to join us at the front here and to respond to your questions and comments.
Thank you very much indeed. And thank you very much indeed, Chris. It was a very eloquently put, beautifully delivered and really thought-provoking and very informative. When you were going through those stories of all those ladies, I was thinking about last 3-4 months. We had received hundreds and hundreds of calls and exactly the same stories. And fathers were talking about the wives, the children. Children don't complain in the school because they are frightened that they will be bullied again. They are being bullied. The wives and the daughters are not complaining because they go on the same route every day and they will face more prejudice, more Islamophobia. And this is what we all have to deal with it. And it is really disheartening to see that we have to, people are challenging our loyalty to this country. I've been here 43 years. My children are born here, but they are not frightened. And these are the things which we have to deal every day. And no matter how much I tell my people to go and report, they don't, because they think nothing will be achieved and they will be subjected to more harm than not. I think the most important thing, it clicked me, last month I was invited to speak in a Cardiff village hall. And I went there, were about 70, 80 people. And believe you me, when they told me that they have never seen a Muslim, and the only perception they have about the Muslim was that they are barbaric, it really frightened me. And after my talk and after having tea and coffee with them, 4 or 5 people came to me and said, I have to say something which I wasn't going to say to you, but now I have to tell you, that when we heard that a Muslim is coming to speak to us, I went to the police and reported about it. And the police then went to the organizers asking about who is he coming, why is he coming, what he's going to talk about. And that really frightens that this is what is happening in reality. As a community, I think it is our responsibility to go and talk to people far away in the villages or village halls and tell them about what Islam is all about, because what they knew about Islam was all through the media, what the papers were saying, and what they have seen on the TV. But what we have said it so eloquently, I just hope that people seize it in this respect and learn it, that we are all one, we are all together. And it's not the responsibility of the Muslim community to deal with this situation. It is our responsibility as a community, as citizens of this country. And we don't need to apologize for the activities of few individuals. And we don't need to prove our loyalty to this country, because this is our home and this is where we have lived and this is where we're going to live. So with that, I'll just say thank you very much indeed. It was really an eye-opener for me. But all those stories you were going through, it was reminding me of the phone calls which I have been receiving it, and the exact same stories And I'm sure in every city of this country, they'll be having this experiences. So thank you very much indeed. And let's invite you to come here. Let's have a chat.
Thanks very much indeed, Salim. It's always an honour to share a platform with Salim. And for human beings. We've had some insights from Salim, and I think it's important now that we have a good conversation together and with our global colleagues as well, and that we'd like you to ask us questions, and please feel free to express your views as well if you have them, or experiences that we should be hearing about. So who would like to kick off, please, and ask the first question or make the first comment?
Right there.
At the back, yes.
Both sides.
Hi.
Thank you very much for organising such initiative. It's very, very needed. Thank you all. It's just I wanted to add something that it's one of the big problems that Islamophobia is not recognised as a term, as a consequences, as an action. And this is not only in the political arena, but also within institutions and within the community. I mean, for example, the police itself, even if I faced a lot of countless Islamophobic attacks. I actually don't report them anymore because there's just too many, and I have a life, that I have a family to look after, and I've got a job and all of that. Now, even when I report it, the police will recognize it as a hate crime, not as an Islamophobic attack. And this will lead to further normalization of the actual action, and it's problematic. Another point that I wanted to mention, that Islamophobia is no longer limited to the far right or to teenagers in the street. I mean, you've got politicians from Labour, Conservative and Lib Dem making Islamophobic comments here and then making it normal for people on the street to do it. It's okay to attack and so on. So I think recognition at a political level is not enough. We need an institution to recognize it in order to tackle it beforehand. And that's my comment. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Christian?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Metropolitan Police now have got are recording Islamophobia as motivation for attacks now. So they have a separate flag. Most police forces actually have a separate flag for anti-Semitism. And so it would be very easy to actually have this rolled out across all of the police forces. From conversations I've had with the Association of Chief Police Officers, there is the issue, which is always put back to me, is that every police authority has a different computer system. And so it would be very difficult for all of those police authorities to actually implement the same policy. The issue is that actually it's very easy to add another tick box below anti-Semitism. So I think you're right. I think that at that kind of institutional level, there is reluctance. I think one of the things there is, again, that it comes back to actually, if the politicians were to take this serious, actually they could push that through at that institutional level. And I think it's interesting that, like sort of Metropolitan Police has gone out on its own to actually do this. So you can actually get data from the Metropolitan Police around Islamophobia. But yeah, you're absolutely right.
There's a question from Abdulaziz here on behalf of the people on the MOOC. Jimmy.
Thank you, Chris. I have two questions from the MOOC, the online course. The first is from Rachel, who asks, with regard to opposition to building of mosques as an example of Islamophobia, would it be far from the truth to suggest that it would be a place for radicalizing young Muslims, as this has been one of the reasons given by opposition to those who are building a mosque in Newham? And the same question really from Alexandra and Christina, who ask what practical kind of policy changes could tackle Islamophobia.
Yeah.
Just Salim, take the first question about the mosques, please.
No, I've got it. Yeah. I don't think it will become a center. This is what Chris was just saying. If we need some space, it is a part of the tradition, it's a part of the religion. And it is, yes, it's a responsibility of the people who are making it or building it, that they make sure that it is done on the right track. So I don't think the fright of the fear of having a mosque will create more radicalized or extremist people is a myth to me, because we know in Cardiff we have got 16 mosques and they're all running beautifully. So it is the people behind the mosque which is important, and I'm sure every due diligence will be done to make sure that it is done properly.
Chris,
Yeah, I just don't know where to look when I'm talking to someone on the MOOC. Where do I look? You know, like it's like, oh, there. Okay, right. Okay. Now it looks weird because it looks like I'm ignoring you and looking straight through you. So okay. In terms of the mosque, what's interesting? I've done research over the last 3 years around the building of Dudley Mosque. Now, I don't know if anybody knows where Dudley is. It's not the most popular place. But Dudley is about 13 miles outside of Birmingham, and it's in an area called the Black Country. If Fox News were to report on the Black Country, we know how they would describe it. So the Black Country is called the Black Country because it's where the Industrial Revolution sort of really took hold, and the landscape used to be black from the soot, so that's why it's called the Black Country. But it's an interesting place because it's distinctly different from the kind of diversity of Birmingham, which is much more kind of embedded and convivial, and very much a part of the everyday spaces. In Dudley, you have this. It's been going on now for about 17 years, and it's the allegation is that the super mosque. So it's called the Dudley Super Mosque. And what's interesting is that still to this day, there's not one brick been laid. There's not planning permission. There's not sort of any land being cleared. And yet, what you've had over that 70 years is a series of campaigns against this mosque. You've had that from UKIP. You've had it from the BNP, you've had it from the EDL. The English Defence League had 2 of their largest marches there. They also took over a building nearby and they played the call to prayer 5 times a day because they said they wanted locals to know what it will really be like when a mosque is there. Now, my research was looking at why are people objecting to this mosque? And it comes back again to this kind of, getting into that grey space. Because not everybody who actually opposed the building of that mosque was doing it because they don't like Muslims or they don't like Islam. Now, what was interesting was I did interviews with 65 people who were opposing the building of the mosque, and around a third of those actually opposed it on planning permission grounds. Very legitimate planning permission grounds on the fact that it was an area demarcated for brown land development. It was meant to be about job creation, wealth creation, and so on. These were very articulate, put forward arguments in terms of that. Then you get into that kind of middle ground where people are kind of saying, it's that kind of thing. I'm not racist or I'm not Islamophobic, but, so you get that. So it's kind of like a little bit more. And then you get the other third where it's explicitly, I hate Muslims. They're trying to take over my town. We should let them go. And I wish I could remember the exact quote, but it's a great quote. It's from my research. But a guy says, I know they say they're mosques, but when you look at it, they look like castles, don't they? And that tower, it looks like a lookout post. I mean, I wonder what they're really doing in there, And this is, these are things. Now, what was interesting was that the people I interviewed had all come together via Facebook as a group to oppose that mosque. And the problem is that where you don't, and actually, when you speak to all of them, they all said that they didn't feel they had a voice. So the people who objected because of brown land development didn't have a voice. They said the local council didn't listen to them. The people who were on this kind of real hard edge, fascist, anti-Muslim agenda, they said that they don't have a voice in Britain anymore. Now, what was the scary thing was they all came together as part of this because they didn't have a voice. And actually, by voicing their opposition between them, they found a community. They found consensus. They found people beginning to agree. Now, that's really worrying because if you don't give people a voice, or you take away that voice, or you take away that space to have those debates, you've got people who are not Islamophobic suddenly making alliances with people who are. And then all of a sudden, you can start to have that bleed across. And so you're creating this problem. So not everyone who opposes a mosque is actually doing it on Islamophobic agenda. But it is problematic when people don't feel as they have a space in them. And I've forgotten the second question. It's the worst question ever. You know, it's second to what can I do to make a difference. You know, that's practical policy things. Well, I think that the woman at the back who first spoke, I think that it's absolutely crucial that it begins to be acknowledged as an actual real phenomenon. You know, let's not worry about Quilliam's report that says that Islamophobia is a term we can't use, you know, because of the fact it's been hijacked by Islamists. You know, this is nonsense. We understand the term. We need to just acknowledge that the phenomena exists. So that would be a first step, you know, really be. The second step also would be to have politicians begin to talk about it, you know, and begin to talk about it away from the realm of counterterrorism and security and extremism, and actually do an actual sort of, you know, an evidence gathering. When I was on the government working group, and I publicly resigned last year because I become increasingly frustrated. One of the things I wanted was to get an evidence base. What do we actually know about Islamophobia? Let's look across all of the kind of formal statistics, the informal statistics, the kind of state and institutional data, the kind of community data as well, so that we get this whole picture. The government has done that. The government has done that, but they won't publish it. And that in itself is a big issue. And I'm probably not supposed to say that they actually did that research, but it was done by the University of Warwick last year. And I have a copy if anybody wants a copy.
Right, queue up. Any more questions? No, then, right. I think the person at the back there put a hand up before.
Yes, it's a big one, but it seems to me that alongside the politics, one of the major issues is the media, and it's broadly across all media, from tabloids to even left-wing media and our news and international news, that perpetrates images that create a really strong impression of Islamophobia among the majority of say, the UK or in a global sense. How on earth do we begin to challenge our media, and where are the watchdogs? How do we address this? And I know it's a huge kind of big one, but it does seem to be a huge part of the problem.
Okay, the media is extremely problematic, and I'm gonna steal an example that one of the Jamil students gave me earlier. I'm not sure he's here. I should have just taken it and made out as my own. And he was saying that he was in a supermarket at the weekend, and there was a lot of coverage around Jihadi John. As I said previously, I find it really distasteful that we kind of give a kind of jokey moniker to, you know, someone who's committing, you know, acts of real barbarism. But he said that actually on one of the newspapers there was a close up of the kind of the face and the kind of covering of Jihadi John, and it had like the crosshairs of a rifle, and it said something along the lines of "we need to kill him" or "we need to shoot him" or something like this. Now, when he was telling me this, I thought immediately, isn't it similar how the visual image of Jihadi John is extremely similar as well to the kind of visual image that we see of Muslim women, the 90% or 95% of the Muslim women wearing the niqab. And so actually, if you are walking past that, to what extent are you making that link? Well, you know, we need to shoot him. Well, actually, let's shoot everyone who looks like him. Let's shoot everyone who looks, you know, like, you know, the way the media represents, like, you know, sort of Muslims in this way. So it's really, so, you know, so the media is really, really problematic. Now we have a number of issues here. Is that you have the right wing that is kind of presented, the right wing media, which kind of presents the Muslims and Islam as being a threat to kind of like our security and well-being or so on. But then you have this kind of the left wing, it's against our values and our liberal values. And this was increasingly came out in terms of the kind of Charlie Hebdo thing, you know, around freedom of expression. Now, I'll wholeheartedly back the notion of we have the right to free speech. And we have the right to offend as well, you know, because we should be able to say things that other people don't like. But there's a reciprocal to that as well, is that we also have the right to express our offence. Now, how do Muslims actually have that space? Because actually, if Charlie Hebdo can put a cartoon of the Prophet Muhammad, you know, on the front, well, surely Muslims, I'm not talking about those the idiots who go in with guns and try and shoot people, but what about your normal average Muslim who actually is really upset and really offended by that? How do they actually express that without being kind of falling into this kind of, oh, you're an extremist, you're an Islamist, or so on and so on? So that's another thing as well, to find a voice where Muslims can actually sort of, you know, speak openly. But what you have there with the media as well is you have one other thing, you know, a couple other things. Is that if you look at the Press Complaints Commission, the Press Complaints Commission is a voluntary body. So I think, if I'm right, the Daily Express and the Daily Star have not voluntarily signed up to the Press Complaints Commission. So the Daily Express and the Daily Star can basically say whatever they want, and there's no recourse whatsoever. So there's no kind of watchdog or body that you can go to and complain. And if you do complain about it, you'll get a letter back which says, I'm sorry, they're not part of this voluntary code. Now, what you do have as well then is even those who are part of the voluntary code, is you can say whatever you want about a community, but you can't say what you want about Salim. So if I was to say Salim's a terrorist and a bomber and so on, actually that would be upheld by the Press Complaints Commission. If I said the community that Salim is a part of are terrorists and bombers and suicide bombers, there is no recourse under the Press Complaints Commission whatsoever. And just last weekend, Andrew Gilligan, in an article in the Sunday Telegraph, called me an Islamist. Now, I have no idea what evidence that is, what evidence there is for that. But this is how the media works, is that actually anyone that kind of presents a voice or finds a space or wants to challenge them is immediately earmarked as an Islamist or so on. You know, so I'm actually going through the Press Complaints Commission on that matter now. But the problem is you can say whatever you want about a whole community and there's no recourse whatsoever.
Okay, a couple of questions and we try to take them together. Gentleman then, Aled there. So, here, please. I think then go to Aled and then we'll just take those two and then answer.
Jordan.
Sorry,
Behind the lady.
Oh, yes, you, with a hat on.
Of course you're an Islamist, you've got a beard.
Oh, yeah. But I was in the closet until he outed me. And that's the thing, you see. Like, you know, I was plotting behind everyone's back.
I'm one of the participants on the MOOC, and I've been on the discussion board, so some of this is tempered by that. But just some of the conversations, and I really enjoyed your talk. You started with the bubbling under, and then these incidents happen. I suppose I'd want to pay much more attention to the bubbling under, because nothing needs to happen for Islamophobia.
Yeah.
We've been experiencing it, I wasn't around then, since the 13th century, when drunken boys went and smashed up the place. And it's that, and there's a purpose to it. One of the things you said was, we don't need Islamophobia, but actually maybe Britain does. Maybe Britain does for a whole variety of reasons. It brings me to, you know, who was talking in the American government today. Maybe there are lots and lots of links. I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but it doesn't serve the British government to address Islamophobia, because then it might have to address quite a lot of stuff. That's a really rubbish question, isn't it? I'm not sure anything.
Oh, don't worry, I'll give an overblown answer to it. Like, you know, like, so.
Can we do Aled as well? Then we take the two together and not just try to get more in than we've only got 5 minutes left.
Thank you, Aled Idris, and I've been a member of the Commission for too long. And I think the question I have to ask is, where does this fit in within a pattern, say, of the past 10 years that I've been involved with this arena, where it seems to me that we've had a pattern of saying it's okay to hate. It's okay to hate asylum seekers and refugees at the end of the 90s. It's okay to hate people on benefits. It's okay to hate people who may be obese. It may be okay to hate gays and lesbians. It goes in waves. And I serve the Commission in the disability arena. And of late, we've sadly had it's okay to hate people with disabilities. And this dog whistling sort of politics is now becoming very much an intensified feature of how our politics is done. And of course, the most recent is it's okay to hate Muslims. So I just wondered if you had any thoughts about how we can, if you like, counteract what I come from faith communities, what we call othering.
Yeah.
It's the othering, and it moves on, and it moves to different places and different intensities. And this is just the latest of a whole array of intensities of othering.
Yeah. Okay, so first point, I've written there's a journal article you can read called Islamophobia pre 9/11, which sets out this argument that actually this isn't, something which is just like there. This has continued on, and actually, I'm just writing another article for, I can't even remember the book, but it's about a historical analysis and how history actually informs the present. And it's interesting when you look at history, because anybody can invoke images from history and use it as justification for now. And actually, you'll hear it in terms of the Crusades, you'll hear it in terms of Cordoba by some Muslims. It's like, oh wow, look how peaceful and wonderful it was. And actually, it's just the kind of notion that kind of like you gets a response. So you're asking, what was the second part of the question again? Because I was going to link it to there, and I can't remember what it was.
Something under the surface, I think was the point.
Oh yeah, yeah. Well, there's an interesting, and I think the thing that actually makes that brings on to the point about othering, and what makes Islamophobia so distinct and so different in this present time is the issue of geopolitics. Because actually, if you look back at racism, if you look back at kind of homophobia, there was never the kind of global dimension to it. Whereas now, I think with Islamophobia, you have this global level. And I think that the discourses that we have in the public and political spaces draw as much upon the Middle East as they do on Bradford. I don't think that there's too much of a kind of differentiation between the two. And I think that you can really draw that down, and actually sort of it's all very much that part of the othering, is that, but also the reductionist part of othering as well is that actually the Muslim, the jihadi John, is the same as the Muslim who's probably walking down the street over in in the Cardiff city centre. And I think that that's where the process of othering. And in terms of othering, you're absolutely right. If you look at the British Social Attitude Survey, they show that actually our levels of intolerance and our levels of prejudice in Britain are actually on the rise. And a lot of it is driven, the kind of analysis suggests, is on the back of kind of Islamophobia, but also immigration as well, and the vilification of illegal immigrants, asylum seekers and so on. But you're absolutely right as well in terms of benefits, there is so much othering going on. And I think that a lot of this also feeds into the stereotype of the Muslim, because Muslims are seen to be other. The immigrants are seen to be Muslim, and in fact, the majority actually come from Christian countries. But also, as well, the issue of benefits as well. What was the Sun's front page headline? Jihad seekers allowance. I think that Anjan Chowdhury was on. It was outed. He was on benefits, and it was called jihad seekers allowance. So all of these things come into that space. Yeah.
Okay, one more question, lady there.
Thank you. My name's Jo Glenn and I'm from the Welsh Government. I can just about see you, Chris. I know Salim, and he probably won't be surprised by what I'm going to say. I just wanted to draw attention to the fact that the Welsh Government does take hate crime very seriously. The Welsh Government has got a policy. If you want to read it, if you go to wales.gov.uk/hate crime, and we are putting money into funding support for victims in Wales. So that was just what I wanted to say.
Right. Well, maybe Salim has some comments on what the Welsh Government is doing and how we see Wales.
To be honest, we have been part of it, but the tragedy is that most of the people who suffer these things, they don't go on www, they want somebody to talk to, and that is the thing which keeps them away from it, because they are not educated people, they're not on computer literate. So they have to deal with people facing together, and that's what is the difference.
Right, thank you very much indeed. Right. Well, I think we have to draw it to a close. So thank you very much indeed to both Chris and Salim. And it's been a very, very informative and kind of awakening call, I think, this evening. Certainly I've learnt a huge amount and understood that not only do I need to know what Islamophobia is, but I need to be able to stand up and call it out when I see it, which I think is something we all have to be brave and try and do for the sake of those people who are discriminated against and who need allies. So we have to be those allies, I would suggest. It's great to see so many people come this evening, and great that we've had the MOOC as well. It's been excellent. As Sophie mentioned earlier today, it is part of a series of lectures that the Islam UK Centre are holding. Next week's lecture is called the Darul Ulum, I hope I pronounced it properly, and Mainstream Education, A Way Forward. If anyone is interested in attending this, it starts at 7 p.m. on the 10th of March, and it will also be in this room. So I'd like you to leave here inspired by the knowledge that together that we can and will make a difference in Wales. As a result of our discussion tonight, I hope you will consider taking at least one action to promote human rights yourselves and within your organisations. I said to call it out when you see discrimination. So please get in touch if you would like to explore working in partnership with us. Siwrne ddiogel I chi i'ch cartrefi chi heno. Diolch yn fawr am ddod. Have a safe journey. Thank you very much.
Thank you.